My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 29 years old, and 3 weeks ago I was driving through my old neighborhood when I saw something that made my heart stop. There was a moving truck in the driveway of 428 Maple Street, the house where I grew up, the house my father built with his own hands before he died. Strangers were carrying furniture through the front door. Children were running across the lawn that I used to play on, and a woman I'd never seen before was directing movers like she owned the place. Because apparently she did. My mother had sold our family home without telling me. She hadn't called, hadn't texted, hadn't even mentioned it during our last awkward phone conversation 2 months ago. She just sold it, took the money, and moved on like that house meant nothing. Like my father meant nothing. Standing there on the sidewalk, watching my entire childhood disappear into someone else's life, I made a decision that would change everything between my mother and me forever. I was going to buy that house back no matter what it took, and she would never see it coming. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment letting me know where you're viewing from. Before I tell you about how I pulled this off, hit like and subscribe to hear more real stories about family boundaries and fighting for what matters that might just change how you see your own relationships. Before that devastating afternoon, that house at 428 Maple Street was more than just a building to me. It was the physical embodiment of my father's love, his dedication, and every value he tried to instill in me during his too short life. My father, Daniel Mitchell, was a carpenter by trade and an artist by nature. He spent 3 years building that house from the ground up, starting when my mother was pregnant with me. Every weekend, every evening after work, he was out there measuring, cutting, hammering, creating something that would last. He built it with his own hands, and he built it to be our forever home. I remember everything about that house with a clarity that almost hurts. The front porch had 6 steps, and the third one creaked no matter how carefully you walked on it. My father always said he'd fix it, but he never did, and eventually that creak became part of the house's personality, announcing everyone's arrival or departure. The living room had built-in bookshelves that my father crafted from oak, each shelf perfectly level, each corner precisely mitered. He was so proud of those shelves. The kitchen had a window over the sink that looked out onto the backyard, and my mother used to stand there doing dishes while my father and I played catch on the lawn. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, painted pale yellow because my father said it would catch the morning sun and wake me up gently. He was right. Every morning of my childhood, I woke up to golden light streaming through those windows. But the most special place in that entire house was my father's workshop in the garage. It smelled like sawdust and wood stain, and the walls were covered with tools hung on pegboards, each one outlined in marker so he'd know exactly where it belonged. He taught me how to use those tools, how to measure twice and cut once, how to sand with the grain, how to respect the wood and the craft. We built a bookshelf together when I was 10, a simple project that took us 3 weekends because he insisted on teaching me every step properly. That bookshelf sat in my bedroom until the day I moved out for college, and I always planned to take it with me when I bought my own place. My father died when I was 16, a sudden heart attack that no one saw coming. He was only 42, in the middle of building a treehouse for our neighbors' kids because that's just who he was, always creating, always helping. The loss shattered our family in ways I'm still processing 13 years later. My mother, Caroline, retreated into herself for almost 2 years. The house that had been filled with my father's laughter and the sounds of his projects fell silent. The workshop gathered dust. The tools hung untouched on their pegboards like a museum exhibit of a life interrupted. Then, when I was 19 and away at college, my mother met Richard Thornton at some charity event her grief counselor had encouraged her to attend. Richard was everything my father wasn't. Where my dad had been warm and present and built things with his hands, Richard was cold and distant and made his money managing other people's investments. He was wealthy, drove expensive cars, and had strong opinions about how my mother should be living her life. They married within a year, and I watched my mother transform into someone I barely recognized. My life now was modest but stable. I worked as a graphic designer at a small marketing agency in the city, making decent money but nothing extraordinary. My apartment was a cramped 1-bedroom 40 minutes from my old neighborhood, filled with second-hand furniture and prints I designed myself. I lived paycheck to paycheck like most people my age, careful with my budget, putting a little away each month into savings that never seemed to grow fast enough. I had dreams of owning a home someday, but those dreams felt distant and unrealistic in an impossible housing market. I certainly never imagined that the home I'd end up fighting for would be the one I'd already grown up in, the one that should have been mine all along. My mother, Caroline Mitchell Thornton, used to be my best friend. Before my father died, she was warm and funny, always baking something in that kitchen, always ready to listen to my teenage drama, always present. She had this infectious laugh that would fill the whole house, and she loved my father with the kind of devotion you see in old movies. After he died, something in her broke that never quite healed right. The grief counseling helped her function, but it didn't bring back the woman she used to be. And when Richard entered her life, whatever remained of that original Caroline disappeared entirely. Richard Thornton was a successful financial advisor with a portfolio of wealthy clients and an ego to match. He lived in a modern downtown penthouse before he married my mother, all glass and steel and cold minimalist design. He made it clear from the beginning that he found our family home quaint at best and embarrassingly outdated at worst. At their wedding reception, I overheard him tell one of his friends that the house was a tear down on a valuable lot. My mother laughed uncomfortably and changed the subject, but she didn't defend the home my father had built. That should have been my first warning sign. The promise came during one of the last real conversations my mother and I had before Richard fully took over her life. I was 21, home for Christmas break during my senior year of college. We were sitting in the living room surrounded by the decorations my father used to put up, and I asked her directly what would happen to the house. She took my hand and looked me in the eyes with something like her old warmth. "Sarah, this house will always be in our family," she said firmly. "Your father built this for us, for you. When I'm gone, it's yours. Promise you that. This is your inheritance, your connection to your dad. I would never let anything happen to it." I believed her completely. That promise became a source of comfort during the increasingly strained years that followed. Even as Richard started changing things, even as my father's furniture was replaced with Richard's expensive modern pieces, even as the workshop was cleaned out and converted into a home gym, I held on to that promise. The house itself would be mine someday. The structure, the bones, the essence of what my father had built would survive. But Richard had other plans, and he had my mother's ear in ways I never could after their marriage. He constantly talked about downsizing, about how maintaining a large house was impractical, about investment opportunities and property values. My mother started parroting his language, talking about being practical and moving forward instead of living in the past. When I tried to remind her of her promise, she would get defensive and change the subject. "We're not talking about that right now," she'd say. "Nothing's decided. You worry too much." I also had my younger brother, Tommy, who was only 12 when our father died. He adapted to Richard's presence more easily than I did, perhaps because he was younger or perhaps because Richard made an effort with him that he never made with me. Tommy played golf with Richard, went to business dinners, and seemed content to let our father's memory fade into the background. When I tried to talk to him about the house and what it meant, he would shrug and say, "Mom has to live her life, Sarah. You can't expect everything to stay the same forever." It was like he didn't remember the man who had tucked him in every night, who had been building that treehouse when his heart gave out. The only person who truly understood was my father's best friend, Marcus Webb, who had worked construction with my dad for over 15 years. Marcus still lived in the neighborhood and would check in on me occasionally, sharing stories about my father that kept his memory alive. Marcus had warned me years ago that Richard would try to erase every trace of my dad. "Men like him don't like competition," he told me, "even from ghosts." The discovery happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. I had taken a half-day off work to handle some errands and on impulse, I decided to drive through my old neighborhood. I hadn't been back in almost 6 months. My mother and I had reached a point where our relationship consisted of obligatory holiday phone calls and nothing more. Richard had made it clear I wasn't welcome at their new downtown condo, and I had stopped trying to force a connection that obviously wasn't wanted. But that house, my father's house, still pulled at me like a magnet. I sometimes drove by just to see it, to remember what home felt like. As I turned onto Maple Street, I immediately noticed the moving truck in the driveway. My first thought was confusion. Maybe my mother was finally getting rid of more of the old furniture, though I couldn't imagine why she'd need such a large truck for that. Then I saw them. A family I'd never seen before. A woman in her 30s directing movers, 2 young children chasing each other across the front lawn, A man carrying boxes through the front door like he owned the place. My hand started shaking on the steering wheel. I pulled over across the street and just stared, my brain refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. I grabbed my phone and called my mother with trembling fingers. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice distracted and slightly annoyed. "Sarah, this isn't a good time. Richard and I are meeting with the interior designer for the condo." I could barely form words. "Mom, why are there people moving into the house?" There was a pause, and then she said something that I will never forget for as long as I live. "Oh, that. I meant to mention it. We sold the house 2 months ago. The closing was last week. Richard found a buyer through one of his clients, and the price was too good to pass up. We needed the money for the renovations on the condo." 2 months ago. She had sold my father's house 2 months ago and hadn't bothered to tell me. "You promised," I whispered, my voice breaking. "You promised me that house would stay in the family. You promised it would be mine." My mother sighed like I was being unreasonable, like I was a child throwing a tantrum over nothing. "Sarah, don't be so dramatic. It's just a house. You need to stop living in the past. Your father wouldn't want you clinging to material things like this." I sat in my car for over an hour after that phone call, watching strangers settle into my childhood home, feeling completely powerless. The legal reality was brutally simple. The house had been in my mother's name. She had every right to sell it. My promise, my memories, my father's legacy, none of it mattered in the eyes of the law. I had no claim, no recourse, no way to stop what had already happened. But as I sat there watching the sun set behind the roof my father had shingled himself, a different thought began to form. I couldn't stop her from selling it, but maybe, just maybe, I could get it back. That night I couldn't sleep. Instead, I spent hours online researching the new owners, the sale price, the housing market in that neighborhood. The house had sold for $485,000, a number that seemed impossibly large to someone making $52,000 a year as a graphic designer. With my current savings of barely $8,000 and my student loan debt, buying a house had always felt like a distant dream, something for my 30s or 40s, not now at 29. But this wasn't just any house. This was my father's house, and I was going to find a way. The next morning I called Marcus. If anyone would understand, it would be him. When I told him what my mother had done and what I wanted to do, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Your dad would be proud of you for fighting for this, Sarah. What do you need?" We met for coffee that afternoon, and Marcus helped me create a realistic plan. First, I needed to drastically increase my income. I started taking on freelance design work every evening and weekend, building websites and creating branding packages for small businesses. I picked up a second job working retail on weekends. Every spare hour went into making money. Second, I moved out of my one-bedroom apartment and into a tiny studio that cost half as much. I sold my car and started taking the bus. I stopped eating out entirely, meal prepping cheap basics every Sunday. I canceled every subscription, every luxury, every unnecessary expense. My coworkers asked if I was okay if something had happened. I just smiled and said I was saving for something important. I couldn't tell anyone the real reason. If word got back to my mother, she might interfere somehow, or worse, she might mock my efforts. 18 months after that devastating phone call, I held the keys to 428 Maple Street in my hands. The Johnsons, the family who had bought the house, had been transferred out of state for work and needed to sell quickly. When I made my offer through my realtor, they had no idea who I was or what the house meant to me. They just knew I was a motivated buyer willing to pay asking price. The day I closed on the house was the best day of my life since my father died. I sat in the empty living room, running my hands over the oak bookshelves he had built, and cried tears of relief and triumph. I didn't tell my mother immediately. I spent 2 weeks moving in, unpacking, making the house feel like mine again. But I knew eventually she would find out, and I wanted to be the one to tell her. I called her on a Saturday morning, my voice steady and calm in a way it hadn't been during our last conversation. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something. Can you meet me at 428 Maple Street this afternoon?" There was confusion in her voice. Why would we meet there? That house was sold over a year ago. I took a deep breath. "I know. I bought it. It's mine now." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought she had hung up. Then, "What did you just say?" Her voice was sharp, disbelieving. I bought back Dad's house. I'm living here now. She arrived an hour later with Richard, both of them looking like they'd been slapped. My mother's face was a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like anger. Richard's expression was pure outrage. Sarah, this is completely irresponsible. My mother started before she'd even fully entered the house. How could you possibly afford this? Did you take out some predatory loan? This is financial suicide. I stood in the doorway of my father's house, my house now, and looked at her calmly. I worked 3 jobs for 18 months. I saved every penny. I got pre-approved for a mortgage I can actually afford. I did everything right. Richard stepped forward, his face red. This is spite. Pure spite. You did this to punish your mother for moving on with her life. I shook my head slowly. I did this to preserve my father's legacy. The legacy you sold without a second thought. 6 months later, I wake up every morning in the bedroom where I grew up. Sunlight still streaming through those same windows in that same golden way. I've spent weekends restoring my father's workshop, hanging his tools back on the pegboards where they belong. Marcus comes by sometimes and we work on projects together, keeping my dad's craft alive. The bookshelf we built when I was 10 is back in its place, and I've added new pieces alongside it, things I've made with the skills he taught me. My mother and I speak occasionally, brief and distant conversations that no longer carry the weight of expectation. She never apologized for selling the house, and I've stopped waiting for her to understand why it mattered. Richard remains convinced I've made a terrible financial decision, which tells me everything I need to know about what he values. What I learned through all of this is that some things are worth fighting for, even when everyone tells you to let go and move on. This house isn't just property or investment or square footage. It's my father's hands and heart made solid, a place where his memory lives in every board and beam. I couldn't control my mother's choices or her inability to honor her promises, but I could control my own response. I could work harder than I've ever worked, sacrifice more than I thought possible, and take back what should have been mine all along. My father built this house to last, and now I'm here to make sure it does. Have you ever had to fight to preserve something meaningful that a family member tried to take away? What would you do to protect your parents' legacy? Share your story in the comments below. If this resonated with you, hit like and subscribe for more stories about family, boundaries, and standing up for what's right. Remember, some things are worth fighting for, and you have the right to protect what matters most to you.